Have you ever wondered what it feels like to hold the power of life and death in your hands? To know that a simple action you take could mean the difference between a mother's joyful embrace of her newborn child or her painful death? I have. And let me tell you, it's a weight that can crush a man's soul. I am Ignaz Semmelweis, and I've been called many things. A savior of mothers, a pioneer of medical hygiene, a madman obsessed with cleanliness. But before all that, I was just a doctor who couldn't bear to watch another woman die. You might be wondering why you should care about a long-dead Hungarian doctor. After all, what could my story possibly have to do with your life today? But let me ask you this. Have you ever stood up for what you believed in, even when the whole world told you you were wrong? Have you ever fought against a system so entrenched, so resistant to change, that it would rather let people die than admit its mistakes? I was born in 1818 in Buda, Hungary, the fifth of 10 children. My father was a prosperous grocer, a man who believed in the power of hard work and education. From a young age, I was fascinated by the world around me, always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. My path to medicine was not straightforward. Initially, I enrolled in law school at the University of Vienna. But the law did not ignite my passion. It was the mysteries of the human body, the challenge of healing, that called to me. So I switched to medicine, much to the dismay of my family. The University of Vienna was where I found my true calling. I was captivated by the complexity of the human body, the intricacies of life and death. But it was also there that I began to see the limitations of our knowledge, the gaps in our understanding that could mean the difference between life and death. I graduated in 1844, eager to make a difference. Little did I know, the path I had chosen would lead me to a discovery that would save countless lives, but also to a battle that would cost me everything. It all began here, in the maternity ward of Vienna General Hospital. The year was 1846, and I had just been appointed assistant to Professor Johann Klein in the first obstetrical clinic. But before we go any further, there's something you need to understand about this place, something that will haunt me for the rest of my days. The maternity ward was divided into 2 clinics. While the first clinic where I worked was staffed by doctors and medical students, the second clinic was run by midwives. Now, here's where it gets interesting. The mortality rate in the first clinic was often 5 times higher than in the second. Women would beg on their knees to be admitted to the second clinic. Some even preferred to give birth in the streets. Can you imagine that? Women choosing to deliver their babies in filthy alleys rather than in our supposedly advanced medical facility. What does that tell you about the state of medicine at the time? You see, in those days, we prided ourselves on our scientific knowledge. We thought we knew everything there was to know about the human body. But there was so much we didn't understand, so much we couldn't see. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something crucial, something that could explain why so many women were dying under our care. Night after night, I would lie awake, the cries of dying mothers echoing in my ears. I could still feel their feverish skin under my hands, see the fear in their eyes as they realized they would never hold their babies. But how could I solve a mystery when I didn't even know what I was looking for? How could I fight an enemy I couldn't see? Then, in March 1847, everything changed. My dear friend and colleague, Jakub Kolečka, died after cutting his finger during an autopsy. As I stood over his body, I was struck by a terrible realization. The symptoms that killed Kolečka were identical to those of the women dying in my ward. In that moment, a theory began to form in my mind. A theory so simple, yet so revolutionary, that it would change the course of medical history forever. What if we doctors were the ones spreading death? What if, by moving from the autopsy room to the maternity ward without washing our hands, we were carrying invisible particles of decay from the dead to the living? It seemed too simple to be true, but I had to try something. So, I instituted a policy of hand washing with a chlorine solution before examining patients. The results were immediate and dramatic. The mortality rate in my clinic plummeted from 18% to just over 1%. I had done it. I had found a way to save countless lives with nothing more than soap and water. Can you imagine my excitement? My certainty that the medical community would embrace this life-saving discovery? But I was wrong. Oh, how wrong I was. Instead of gratitude, I was met with hostility. Instead of acceptance, denial. My colleagues, the very men I respected and admired, turned their backs on me. They couldn't accept that they, the esteemed doctors, could be responsible for so many deaths. It was easier to dismiss me as a madman than to face the truth. I tried everything. I published papers, gave lectures, wrote letters to prominent obstetricians all over Europe. But the more I pushed, the more they resisted. Can you imagine the frustration? The huge, irritating feeling, knowing you have the power to save lives, but being unable to convince anyone to listen. And all the while, women continued to die, mothers, sisters, daughters, all sacrificed on the altar of medical arrogance and willful ignorance. Each death was a personal failure. Each mother lost was blood on my hands, because I knew how to save them, but I couldn't make others see. This is where the true cost of my discovery began to show itself, not just in the lives lost, but in the toll it took on my own life and sanity. The more I was rejected, the more obsessed I became. I couldn't let it go. How could I, when lives were at stake? In 1861, I finally published my life's work, The Etiology, Concept, and Prophylaxis of Child-Led Fever. I poured everything into that book. Every statistic, every argument, every plea for reason and compassion. But it was too late. The medical community had already made up its mind about me. The book was largely ignored. I became an outcast, the mad Hungarian doctor obsessed with cleanliness. My colleagues avoided me. My students feared me. Even at home, the tension was thick. My dear wife, Maria, tried to understand, to support me. But how could she comprehend the weight I carried? We had 5 children, you know. Only 2 survived infancy. Each loss, it was like a knife in my heart, a reminder of my failure. I began writing open letters to prominent obstetricians. I called them murderers, ignoramuses. I was burning bridges, but I didn't care. All that mattered was the truth. I became increasingly unsettled. I would burst into lectures, desperate to make them understand. But the more I pushed, the more they pulled away. In 1865, my colleagues decided they'd had enough. They conspired to have me committed to an asylum. I fought them, of course, wouldn't you? But in the end, it didn't matter. I was dragged away, labeled a madman, my cries for reason falling on deaf ears. The asylum was hell. There's no other word for it. The treatments they used, they were barbaric. Cold water dousing, straitjackets, beatings. But you know what the worst part was? It wasn't the physical pain. It was the knowledge that out there, women were still dying, that my life's work, my truth, was being ignored. I died on August 13th, 1865, just 2 weeks after being committed. The official cause was blood poisoning, likely from injuries sustained during my confinement. Ironic, isn't it, that I should die from the very thing I spent my life fighting against? A simple infection spread by unclean hands. It wasn't until years after my death that my ideas were finally accepted. Louis Pasteur's germ theory provided the scientific basis for what I had discovered through observation, and intuition. Today, hand washing is a fundamental practice in every hospital around the world. Countless lives have been saved. But at what cost? So what's the moral of my story? Is it a triumph of science over ignorance? A tragedy of a man driven mad by his own discovery? Or is it a cautionary tale about the dangers of challenging the status quo? Perhaps it's all of these things, but I believe there's a more important lesson here. One that's as relevant today as it was in my time. The greatest enemy of progress is not ignorance, but the illusion of knowledge. When we think we know everything, we close our minds to new ideas, no matter how life-saving they might be. Science has come a long way since my time, but human nature remains the same. There are still truths out there, waiting to be discovered. Ideas that could save millions of lives. So I ask you, what are you willing to sacrifice for the truth? How far would you go to save lives? And most importantly, what truths are you ignoring today, simply because they challenge what you think you know? My name is Ignaz Semmelweis. I saved countless lives and died in disgrace. My story is over, but yours is still being written. And now, if you liked this story, I recommend you subscribe to the channel. There are more stories to come.